so we're, continuing our studies in the book of Daniel, and it is my intention we come tonight to the 8th chapter. Now, I really can't do a deep teaching on it, and in a couple next week we will get into it. But here we are. Tomorrow's December 1st, and we're at that time of year where we just had Thanksgiving and Christmas is coming up, and for the Jewish people, they celebrate something called Hanukkah. And you often wonder, what's Hanukkah all about? Well, actually, Hanukkah is like birthed out of an event that's found in the book of Daniel, chapter 8 and chapter 11. So I thought for this time of year, we'll take a look at it. And next week, we'll get in depth into Daniel 8 and then 9 and 10 and 11 and 12, and we'll finish the book. But I thought we'd take a look. Now, if you remember, in the 7th chapter, what God is doing in the second half of the book of Daniel is he's now beginning to reveal prophecies and visions to his prophet, because as he told one of his other prophets, he reveals his secrets to his servants, the prophets, because these books are given to us for our comfort, our edification, and our learning. And Daniel gets this vision in the 7th chapter that the times of the Gentiles are going to extend through a long period of time. Daniel doesn't know how long. Here you and I are sitting here 2,670 years after the vision was given to Daniel, and the times of the Gentiles still hasn't ended. But he shows him, he said, these times of the Gentiles are going to be these 4 great world empire kingdoms. The lion is Babylon, and then the bear is the Medo-Persians, and then the leopard will be the kingdom of Greece, and then finally the last one will be the dreadful beast that is the Roman Empire, and it will have a second birth where it has 10 kings. And so the first and the second coming of the Roman Empire. And this is all laid out to him. And when Daniel looked at it, he just said, end of the verse 28, the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me. I mean, this is a lot to digest, that here I am, this little person who's only living maybe 80 or 90 years, and God's got this plan for 20 plus centuries, and this is a lot for me to digest. But of course, we have a big God, and he's got a lot of work that he's doing. Now, what God's going to continue to do with Daniel in these subsequent chapters is continue to build upon that what he's begun to show him. And in the 8th chapter, Daniel's going to have a vision of the ram and the he-goat, and we'll study that in depth next week. But what I wanted to show you is when he's looking at this thing, Gabriel has to come. In verse 15, it came to pass that when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision, and I sought for the meaning, behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice, and it said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. And the angel Gabriel is going to come and explain the thing to him. And he says in verse 19, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation. At the time appointed, the end shall be. And all he's letting us know is a truth, that God has an appointment book. And he puts various appointments. You ever get an appointment like, I got to see the dentist, or I got to see the doctor, and I know in 2 weeks on Tuesday I got to go then? Well, and you write it in your appointment book. Well, God has an appointment book for certain appointments for mankind. For individual men, it's appointed on a man once to die, and for nations and kingdoms. And God has a time appointed when it's going to be the end. God knows the expected end. God knows when it's going to be. He's going to finally wind this thing up. Now, he tells him in verse 20, Daniel, the ram which thou sawest, because you saw a ram with 2 horns coming out of the east. Well, that ram, these are the kings of Media and Persia, the 2 horns. And so that animal is the Medo-Persian Empire. And I know, Daniel, you looked then to the west, and you saw a male he-goat coming in the opposite direction, running toward the ram, verse 21, and that rough goat that you saw is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And Daniel is being given visions of what's going to happen in about 170, 200 years afterwards, is the fact that the first king of the Grecian Empire is going to be Alexander the Great. And verse 22, and what's going to happen, that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, and four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. And what he's showing you there, and now we're going to go to the 11th chapter, because God is going to continue to build on the prophecies and to fill in more and more details. One of the things we're learning in the way that God writes his book of Revelation, he often likens his word to seed. And he'll take a seed and he'll plant it and in your heart, and then when you're ready for more, he'll let that seed begin to grow into a sapling and then into a tree, and he'll put more branches on it, and he builds. And we're going to particularly see this when we get to the 9th chapter, and God is going to give Daniel a little seed in verses 24 through 27, just 4 little verses that later on Jesus is going to take in the Olivet Discourse and turn it into 2 chapters with 80 plus verses. And then he's going to give it to John the Revelator in chapter 6 through 19 and just take this little thing and grow it. And God is showing he would like you to learn, and he'd like you to learn more, and you start and you build. And this is how we learn. And he's doing this with Daniel here. And in the 11th chapter, what he's going to do in chapter 11, and we're doing this just because we want to do this particular study of Hanukkah. We are going to study the 8th chapter in depth, and we're going to study one of the most difficult chapters historically, which is the 11th chapter in depth. It's 45 verses. It's going to take us a couple of weeks to get through it because I want to lay out all the history that God gives to Daniel. It's actually history in advance. And it's so incredible when we go through the 11th chapter. I was looking at some encyclopedias today, and he lays out the Syrian wars hundreds of years before they occur. And in the encyclopedia, the 6 Syrian wars are there, and he's going to lay out these people. And in the 11th chapter, he's filling in, and he puts some bones, and now he's putting some flesh and sinews, and he's filling the thing in. And chapter 11, verse 1, and in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood to confirm and strengthen him. And he says that this is Gabriel speaking to him. And now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And what he's beginning to show him is that Daniel is living at the time of Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian, and they are the 2 rulers of the Median-Persian Empire. And he's saying there are going to be 3 kings in Persia that will come after them. And I have them all in the notes when we do the 11th chapter. I'll lay them out for you and exactly when they ruled. And the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And the 4th one is going to be a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who's going to take over around 180 AD. And so this is going to be about 370 years after Daniel's prophesying. And this 4th man that's going to take over is going to be richer. No, actually in Persia, I'm sorry. I'm jumping ahead. The Persian king is going to be Ahasuerus from the book of Esther. We're going to get to Antiochus a little bit. Remember, my notes are at home, so I'm trying to go off memory. And I got to admit, history is hard for me, remembering all these people and their dates. But the 4th king is Ahasuerus from Esther chapter 1. And if you remember what happens in the book of Esther chapter 1, it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, which reigned, verse 1, from India to Ethiopia, and he had 127 provinces. And he's showing Daniel what's going to happen in about 70 or so years later, Daniel, is there's going to be a Persian ruler that's richer than all the others when the kingdom is at its zenith, and it has all these provinces in it. And what he's going to do is, by his strength and all his riches, he's going to go against the realm of Grecia. And he's going to go and try and take the empire in Greece. And Book of Esther, chapter 2, after these things, the wrath of Ahasuerus was appeased. Because what happened is he got a whole bunch of troops, and he marched all the way from the east, all the way over to Greece, and he attempted to take it, and he was defeated in a 3-year war there. And he came back, and he was very upset. And verse 3, a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and according to his will. And he's talking about what happened is the mighty king is Alexander that came from Greece, and it actually came back in a rebound against Persia and beat the Persians. And verse 4, and his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven. And that's the same thing we saw back in the 8th chapter, where it said when it would broke up in verse 22 that 4 kingdoms shall come out of it. Now what had happened was when Alexander died as a young man, because he was an alcoholic, he kind of drank himself to death, and he didn't take care of himself, and he caught an infectious disease, and he died, I think, at 33, 34 years old. His 4 generals took over, and this is what happens. And so he's just showing in the near term of the 11th chapter, and we'll study it. I'll have all the dates for you, that when his kingdom, verse 4, shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven. The eastern part of his kingdom was east and west. The eastern part was Asia Minor, given to General Lysimachus. The western part was the Macedonian part, given to the General Cassander. There was the north and the southern part. The northern part was given to Syria, that was Seleucus, and the southern part was Egypt, and that fell into the reign of Ptolemy. And these 4 generals, verse 4, not his posterity, none of them were related to him, nor according to his dominion, which he ruled. They're going to rule in a different manner. What's his name? Alexander was trying to unite the Grecian Empire. They're going to divide it, and each one is going to take a portion to themselves. And his kingdom is plucked up and broken by those 4 men. So the near part of the prophecy in the 11th chapter is Greece will defeat Persia. And I just want you to be sure of that, because I know right now you're living at the time of Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian, and it looks like they have everything under control, and they just beat the Babylonians. But all things are going to change down here, one generation to another generation, one empire to another one, and I'm telling you ahead of time how it's going to happen. And it's laid out. And then what he does in verses 5 through actually the rest of the chapter, but particularly through verse 35, is what he's going to do is he's going to say, now, Daniel, because you're a Jew, and because this prophecy, and the most important thing to you, and the most important thing to me as Emmanuel, the Father of Israel, is what's going to happen to your land. I'm not going to focus on Macedonia or Asia Minor, the east or the west. I'm going to focus on the north and the south. In verse 5, you'll see the king of the south shall be strong. And then you'll read about the king of the north. And what's going to happen is he's going to say, viewed from Israel's standpoint, right above it is Syria, and beneath it is the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt. And these 2 kings are going to fight. And sadly for you, your land is going to be the area they're going to fight on. They're going to want to fight on, let's call, neutral territory. They're going to want to take each other, but as their armies are marching toward each other, they're going to fight in your land. And this is going to happen over and over and over. Now, once in a while, if they try a sneak attack, the northern guy, in order to get to the south, is going to trample through your land and take supplies from you. And the southern guy is going to trample through your land on the way to the north and take supplies from you. And this is one of the sad things that's going to be happening. And he lays out here in verses 5 through 35 what's known as the Syrian Wars. As Syria from the north fights with the Egyptians from the south, 6 wars over a 170-year period, with Israel stuck in the middle and Israel getting trampled. And he lays it out very well here, and we're not going to study it now. We will study it when we get to the 11th chapter. We'll reconcile it with all the historical battles, and they're laid out here. But one of the things he wants to show is that verse 29. At the time of, okay, let me just show you verse 27. Both of these kings, the king of the south and the king of the north, they basically exist to do mischief. And if they ever get together, and they did, they had some so-called peace treaties along the 170 years that they would sign, they'll speak lies at one table. And they'll, oh yeah, we're going to do this, and then they'll break their peace treaties. And all again, God is trying to show us in the Bible is the heart of man is deceitful and desperately wicked. And as the Apostle James would write later in the New Testament, and I'll get the passage for you, why are there wars? And he'll answer us the reason there are wars, whence come these wars and these fightings? They come of your lusts that war in your own members. You lust and you have not. You kill, you desire to have, you cannot obtain. You fight, you war, and you have not because you ask not. And the problem with the sin nature is it lives for self-gratification and self-preservation and self-aggrandization, just getting more and more and more. And that's the sin nature. And these two kings their hearts are to do mischief. And again, he's trying to show Daniel, I wish God's people would read this stuff. I wish God's people would read this stuff. He's not just talking 24 centuries ago. He's talking 24 minutes ago, right now in Albany and in Washington. Lost people in charge are liars that do mischief. God's trying to tell his people, don't you ever put your hope in lost people. I don't care what promises they make to you. Of course, God's people don't learn, and they're still Christians trying to save America. You're not going to save America any more than Medo-Persia or Greece or Rome got saved. God's trying to show his men, I'm going to destroy all these Gentile nations. There's only one nation that can rule, Israel, and with only one king, the King of Kings. He's the only one that's wonderful, the Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father. He's the only Prince of Peace. These men stand and lie at each other. It shall not prosper. The end shall be at the time appointed. I'm going to put an end to this. It'd be nice if pastors read this stuff and woke up and smell the coffee. By the way, I like freeze-dried crystals, just like Mr. Bookman. You just put them right in the freezer, and you take them out when you want it. That's another story. Now these two kings, he's just showing the peace processes of lost men. You can't trust them. How many times have we seen the peace process in the Middle East in our lifetime? And it gets broken every time. Why? That's what the fallen nature does. True peace only comes when the Spirit of God is involved. And when you put men at a table, they're going to lie one to another because their heart is deceitful. But however, the end will come. Now, verse 28, the king shall return into his land with great riches, and his heart will be against the holy covenant. And he's going to do exploits, physical, human exploits, to just enrich himself and return to his own land. Verse 29, and at the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south. And here's the northern king of Syria, the Syrian wars. But it shall not be as the former or the latter. Something is going to happen in verse 30. Now, historically, what happened, there is a man that came forward. He is, his name was Antiochus the Fourth, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, called himself. And this man decided, his hope was that he could sneak up on Egypt and he could take it and he could build an alliance and strengthen himself, because at the very time he was working, which was 170 BC, there was a new nation beginning to grow and build itself. Now, remember, this all came from Alexander the Great. So we're looking at the end of the Empire of Greece. This new nation was the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic was building itself in the 3rd century BC and in the 2nd century BC. And it's building up. And what happened was, verse 30, for the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Now, his plan was, I want to attack Alexandria, Egypt. I want to come down, end of verse 20, in the middle of verse 29, toward the south, but not as in the former time. Or even the latter. I'm going to try a dual attack. I'm going to try a land attack through the Sinai Peninsula toward Alexandria and a naval attack through the Mediterranean Sea. And I'm going to get my ships to the port of Chittim, which is in the island of Cyprus. This is all written in secular history. You can read this. So he sends a couple of ships over to Cyprus. Now, the Roman Senate was growing in power, and the Roman Senate at that time wasn't involved in this they've been in civil war for 6 wars now, Syria and Egypt. And you know what was happening during the war? They were depleting themselves of manpower as men were being killed and resources, and they were weakening themselves. The Romans were growing in power, and the Romans were recognizing, in order to grow, we need certain areas. We need a good naval base in Cyprus. So they sent their navy to Cyprus, and they intercepted the very few ships that Antiochus had left. They intercepted his ships, and then they came down with their ships to Alexandria. And when he got to Alexandria, verse 30, the ships of Chittim came against him. And it's written in secular history, and I have a copy of it at home. I can bring it to you. And what happened was Antiochus got to Alexandria with his army behind him, expected the navy to be there, and all of a sudden the Roman navy was there with their ships. And an ambassador by the name of Papias was sent. And he came forward and he told Antiochus, he said, the Roman Senate wants you to take your troops and go home. And if you attack Alexandria, Rome wanted Alexandria and the library there. If you attack Alexandria, it's a declaration of war against the Roman Empire. And Antiochus said, well, I'm going to take it up with my counselors and I'll get an answer back to you. And Papias drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and said, you'll decide before you step outside this circle. And I'll know what the answer is to give to the Senate. Meaning you step outside this circle without making a decision, you just declared war on Rome. And Antiochus wasn't stupid. He knew he was in no position to take on Rome. Back to where we are, verse 30. And right there, he just bowed down and said, no, I'm not going to fight with Rome. And so the ships of Chittim came against him, and he walked back humiliated. And he was grieved. And as he returned, he had indignation against the Holy Covenant. And he came through Israel, and he decided to take out his anger on the Jews. I call that misplaced aggression. He decided to kick the dog, if you will. And he took it out on the Jews. Now, I'm reading from a couple of books here. A very good one if you want to study it. Dave Hunt's book, A Cup of Trembling. And I'm on page 152 in here, and this is the chapter on anti-Semitism and the mystery of anti-Semitism. And he's looking back, and what Dave is saying is anti-Semitism is nothing new. You can trace it back to the earliest ages of antiquity. The Jews and the nation of Israel have been the object of persecution and attempted extermination for a long time, since the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar and the building up of the times of the Gentiles. And this has gone on for 2,500 years. For example, what happened to them under Antiochus Epiphanes is only one example of what the Jews have had to suffer repeatedly. He came back and he was grieved, and he decided to have indignation against the Holy Covenant. Antiochus was humiliated by Papias, and when he came back in his violent anger because of what he had suffered in Alexandria, he decided to dissolve the laws of Israel and compel the Jews to be Hellenized, they call it. Compulsory Hellenization, which I thought meant that all the men had to go out with a girl named Helen, but that's not what it means at all. It means that they were trying to force them to be Greek and to speak the Greek language. Now, the Jews hated that, but beyond just speaking Greek, he wanted them to sacrifice at the Greek temples. He wanted to convert, and he took the temple in Jerusalem and converted it to the temple of Zeus and put swine's flesh upon the altar. Now, he also outlawed infant circumcision, and anyone that opposed was put to death. This is one small portion that he has here taken from Durant's book, The History of Civilization. You've probably seen that huge compendium, The History of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. I don't know if years ago they used to have book clubs. And when you wanted to join the book club for 39 cents, you'll get these books plus the volumes of the History of Civilization. And this is in Durant's work there. Now, here's what he goes on to say. Hunt says, this is a familiar fact in history that can't be explained. I mean, there's no real explanation for the fate that the Jews have endured and the persecution that they've had to put up with for thousands of years. This fate has been meted out consistently all around the world, many times in history, at the hands of a wide variety of oppressors. It adds to both the tragedy and the mystery. Now, without a Bible, you couldn't understand it. But with the Bible, we understand that God told them, as long as you stay in the land under my covenant, my hand of protection is there. But when you go out, you will become a byword among all the nations, and you will not be reckoned among the nations. You will remain Jews. You're not going to be like the Cesaron family and move to America and become Americans. You're going to stay Jews wherever you move, and everyone's going to recognize you there, and you're going to face the persecution because you don't belong there. You should be in the land. God's trying to use it to get them back to the land. Anyways, Will Durant provides this insight concerning Antiochus and reveals his hatred of Judaism would do credit to any Hitler, and yet it was 2,000 years before Hitler. And Durant goes on and writes, Antiochus marched up to Jerusalem, slaughtered thousands of men and women and children. He looted the temple for the gold altar, the gold vessels, the silver, all the treasures. He gave orders for the compulsory Hellenization of all Jews. He commanded that the temple be rededicated as a shrine to Zeus, and that a Greek altar be built over the old bronze altar, and the usual sacrifices of the lambs be replaced with the sacrifice of pigs. Now, you know your books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that's forbidden and unclean. He forbade, that's to forbid, the keeping of the Sabbath or any of the Jewish festivals. He made the circumcision of a child a capital offense. Throughout Judea, the old religion and its rites were interdicted and couldn't do it anymore, and the Greek rituals were made compulsory on pain of death. Every Jew was forced to eat pork, and if he refused, he could be burned. If we found the book of the law in a Jewish home, that individual was to be jailed or killed if he was sharing it with someone, and the book was to be burned. The agents and the bureaucrats of Antiochus and their soldiers put an end to all visible expression of Judaism in Jerusalem and Judea. They passed like a searching fire into the towns and villages. Everywhere they gave the people the choice between participation in Greek and Hellenic worship or death. And they must eat the sacrificial swine. All the synagogues were closed. The Jewish schools were closed. They were forced to work on the Sabbath, and if they didn't, they were outlawed, and many were killed. There was the day called the Bacchanalia, which was a big pagan festival, and the Jews were compelled to deck themselves with ivy like the Greeks, and to take part in the parades and the processions, and to sing wild songs in honor of the gods Dionysius and the goddess Diana. Many of the Jews conformed to the demands. Go back to where we are in verse 30 and 31. Verse 30. He'll have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Now, what happened was many Jews conformed to the demands. They just buckled right under. They didn't stand for the faith of the Lord Jehovah. They didn't stand for what they were taught. There were men like the Herodians that he had intelligence with, and they showed him, well, this is a way to get our people to conform to what you're doing. Okay, very, very sad, but this is true, and Durant is writing about it right here. But however, other Jews refused. Some hoped the storm would pass, but others fled into the mountains, into the caves. Remember in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, when Paul is trying to write to the Hebrews and remind them, and he says, yes, there were men who stopped the mouth of lions, who subdued kingdoms, who wrought righteousness, who obtained promises, who quenched the violence of fire and escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness, they were made strong. They waxed valiant in the fight. We're going to read about one in a moment that God raised up. They turned the armies of the aliens to flight, and women received the dead raised to life again through Elisha and Elijah. But others had trials of cruel mockings and scourgings, and they were stoned, and they were sawn asunder because they stood for the faith. They were slain with the sword. They wandered in sheepskin, goatskins. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. These are what the faithful Jews did. And they ran out to those places, and they would glean little bits from the field, and they were going to carry on with resolution the ordinances of Jewish life, and they would circumcise their children, and they would meet on the Sabbath near a waterway, and they would pray. If a woman was caught with a newborn baby who was circumcised, they were dragged back to Jerusalem and thrown over the wall into the valley of Hinnom, where they died. It was about a 200-foot drop onto rocks. Antiochus's men, though, were surprised to find the strength of these old Jewish men and their faith. For centuries, they had never seen such loyalty to an idea or faith. The stories of martyrdom went from mouth to mouth, and they filled the books of history called 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, Daniel just is given a little bit of the prophecy, and God doesn't record any of this in his scriptures. Now, here's what I believe is going to happen. When you and I meet the Lord in the millennium, we're going to get the third portion of the Bible, because God does things in threes. And we've seen that portrait when we studied the book of Isaiah, if you remember, in chapters 35 through 39. And if not, don't worry about it. But if we were Old Testament Jews, we didn't know a second portion was coming, but it came. And now, as New Testament Christians reading, we can see God's got a third portion waiting for us. And the third portion is going to be the filling in of the history, because the Old Testament ends with the book of Malachi, and there's 400 years of silence. And there's all kinds of history missing. And the other thing that's missing is at the Acts of the Apostles, there's silence as to what happened in the church age. And what God is going to do, he's going to bring, there are three bearing record in heaven. These books are going to be brought forward for you and for me to read. And we're going to get to read these books. And it's going to be a blessing. And but anyways, here he doesn't show us these things, but there are books that have been written in secular history: First and Second Maccabees, Eusebius, Josephus, the Didache. I don't know if you've ever heard that term. If you've studied historical scholarly material, I'll give it to you when we do the 11th chapter. Didakos is a Greek word for successor. And these four generals that took Alexander's kingdom and divided it amongst themselves and made four kingdoms of their own are known as the Didache, the successors, and their history has been written. And these things have been written down. Now, Judaism, the Jews, in the meantime, had been very near assimilating in with these people. But all of a sudden, when Antiochus came in and forced them to have swine, the strong ones that went to the mountains and the caves intensified their consciousness toward God and the old faith. And they withdrew into a protective stance back there, and marvel of marvels that Judaism could survive at all. But it was the work of God. In spite of this diabolical persecution, the Jews were clinging now to their religion. Persecution strengthened their faith, just like it did in the book of Exodus. I don't know if you remember in chapter 1. Therefore they set over them taskmasters to afflict them with burdens. Verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and the more they grew. And the truth of the matter is, God uses persecution and affliction to strengthen us. Just like no pain, no gain. Just like working out, when I was learning years ago, when I tried to work out, I'm not good at it, but you can see some of the men here are muscular guys. When you're lifting weights, you're actually just breaking muscle. And then it's on the day you rest where the muscle rebuilds. But the affliction and the breaking of the muscle allows it to rebuild. And God has put that down here. And these Jews are building up. And what happened was God raised up a man named Judas Maccabee, who was the son of a priest. And Judas Maccabee also was a warrior. And Durant writes in the History of Civilization, Volume 2, the History of Greece, he says, Maccabee's courage equaled his faith and his piety. Every battle that he entered into, the first thing he did was he prayed like a saint. But when the hour of the battle arrived, he was like a lion in his fighting ability and his rage. And he raised up a little army that lived in the mountains. They lived after the manner of beasts, Durant writes, feeding on herbs. Every now and then they would descend upon a neighboring village, and they would kill the soldiers from Syria and pull down the pagan altars. And if they found a child who was Jewish uncircumcised, they circumcised him valiantly. When this was reported to Antiochus back in Syria, Antiochus Epiphanes, he sent his army of Syrian Greeks to destroy the Maccabean force. Judas met them in the pass of Emmaus. And though the Syrians were trained mercenaries, fully armed, and his band was poorly armed, they won a complete victory in 166 BC. So Antiochus sent a larger force, whose general was so confident, he even brought slave merchants from Syria with him, figuring when we finally beat these Jews, you can buy the ones that we've captured and sell them, and posted the town what the price would be for these Jewish slaves. And Judas defeated these troops at Mizpah so decisively that he recaptured Jerusalem. And he removed all the pagan altars and the ornaments from the temple. And he cleansed and he rededicated it. And this is when the feast of Hanukkah was born, at the rededication of the temple. Now, for this one here, I had to go to a book written by a Jewish man, Victor Bazin, a German Jew. called the Feasts of Israel. And let me see if I can find it here. Story behind the Feast of the Dedication. Now, it's very interesting. If you study the Old Testament, the feasts were given in Leviticus 23. By the way, just real quickly, look at verse 31 in the chapter we were. Arms shall stand on his part. That means he has armies. And they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Now, this is the deep part of prophecy that you just wish there was one interpretation, but there's a dual interpretation. There was the abomination of desolation before the first coming of Christ by Antiochus right here. And there will be the abomination of desolation before the second coming of Christ by the Antichrist, of whom Antiochus is a type. Now, interestingly here, verse 33, he says, verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. That was the Herodians and people he got. By the way, that is the time when the Hasmonean dynasty gets born, which is where the Herods come from. But the people that know their God shall be strong and do exploits. This is Judas Maccabee and his brothers. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. And they went out, and they'll, of course, fall by the sword and flame and in captivity and spoil many days. Now, when they fall, they'll be hoping with a little help. And that's what God's going to do, is help them up. Now, here's what happens at this particular time. The 7 feasts of the book of Leviticus, and we know them, is the Passover with the feast of the unleavened bread and the first fruits. So there's kind of 3 altogether. Then the Pentecost, that's month number 1. Then month number 3 is the Pentecost. And then verse 7 is the Feast of the Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of the Tabernacle. So it's 3, 1, and 3. It's a picture of the menorah as the central branch and the 3 branches on each side. Okay, and so God laid those feasts out, and there is no feast of Hanukkah or dedication. Yet Jesus celebrated it. Go to John chapter 10. John chapter 10, and that's the great chapter where Jesus, he would say 7 times, I am the bread of life, I am the resurrection. And then this is the one chapter where he says, I am 2 times. And he says, verse 7, I am the door. Verse 9, I am the door. And verse 11 and 14, I am the good shepherd. And he gives a double verily, verily, of the great I am. And it's in that 10th chapter where, verse 22, at Jerusalem, the feast of the dedication in winter. And Hanukkah occurs in the month of December. And Hanukkah is during the winter. And here's Jesus at the feast of Hanukkah. And he's holding it up, and he's telling them in verse 27, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me, and I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish. A great teaching at the feast of Hanukkah by the Lord Jesus Christ, in a feast that occurred beyond the Levitical feasts. Why am I telling you this? Because I'm telling you that God works with his people even in what we consider times of silence. And it's just, you go home, you think about it, and we'll learn a lot about this in the millennium. But here's what happened at this, in Bas Boeken writes in the book on the Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication. It was winter, the Feast of Dedication, and Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. And this is the only place in the New Testament where the Feast of Dedication, which the Jews called Hanukkah is mentioned. Now, this festival has been celebrated since the year 164 BC, and it continues to the present time. It often coincides with the time of Christmas. For them, it starts on the 25th day of the month Kislev, the Jewish month which approximates our December. Now, the commemoration of this, interestingly, the story behind it, when Antiochus Epiphanes took over, this godless man, this vile man, and took over Jerusalem and the altar, and he sacrificed a pig to the Greek god Jupiter, and he forbid the Jews in the Holy Land to observe their religion. And the Syrian officers and supervisors were dispatched into every city and village in Israel to enforce his cruel and blasphemous decrees. And the Jews fled. There was a man by the name of Matthew the Maccabee, and he was a priest. And one day, one of Antiochus's men came to a village with a decree, and Matthew stood up and began an uprising against him. And when he was killed, his son Judas Maccabee picked up the fight on his behalf. And they fought in the mountains and in the valleys. Judas had 4 brothers, and they attacked the invaders in guerrilla fashion. They gave the Syrian army no relief and no respite. They gained strength. Other Jews joined them. They ventured. They faced their enemies in open battles, and they finally defeated them, and they drove them from Jerusalem together with the disloyal priests. And after they cleansed the holy temple, and they demolished the polluted altar of Zeus, on December the 25th in 164 AD, they rededicated the temple of God amid great rejoicing and consecrated a new altar in place of the old. But they did not know what to do with the stones of the old altar. Those stones were sacred and precious. But at the same time, those stones had been polluted and unfit because of all the pigs that had been laid there. So they decided to take those stones, keep them together in a corner of the temple, and they were waiting for Elijah to come to tell them what to do. Now, they prayed and they decided to rededicate the temple. Hidden in the nooks of the temple, one of the Maccabean Jews found a small jar of the consecrated oil that Antiochus's men didn't take. Figured, who needs oil? We want gold. We want silver. We don't need a jar of oil. And this was used in the former days for the perpetual light in the temple. You got to go to 2 Kings chapter 4. God had said, you keep the lights burning always before me. And this was the time when Elisha was doing the work. And it came to pass, verse 6, when the vessels were full, 2 Kings 4:6, she said to her son, bring me a vessel. And he said to her, there's not a vessel more. And the oil stayed. And God kind of promised there, I'm going to make sure the oil stays in the temple, even if you ignore. I know that's not directly what it's saying, but that's what God is saying. And they went there and they found that oil there. But the problem was they only had enough oil to light the candlestick for one night. But miraculously, the little cruse of oil stayed for 8 days. They would pour it out and it was full again. They would pour it out and it was full again until a new supply could be prepared. It took 1 week to prepare more oil. And in memory of the wonderful redemption from the hands of the wicked enemy and the help of God in rededicating the temple, it was decreed that for 8 days, 8 candles will be lit in every Jewish household, beginning with 1 on the first day, 2 on the second day, and progressively unto the 8th day. And this is how the feast of dedication was begun. And here's Jesus in the temple, celebrating the feast of dedication with them. Hanukkah, the light. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. And here it is. The Lord is rededicating, the temple of the Lord being rededicated amid great rejoicing, and it's still today served. Now, the hope of Hanukkah is the light. And Jesus is the light of the world. Today, unfortunately, the Jewish people only see the physical miracle, and they haven't seen the spiritual miracle of the true light of the world. And so I just, wanted to share with you, where did this come from? It came from a great event during the time of the period of silence that was kind of hidden here in the book of Daniel, chapters 8 and 11. And again, I'll do a better job at teaching 8 and 11th chapter when I have my notes and I have more time to prepare. I'm sorry for tonight. Yes. First and second Maccabees are accurate history. Where they drift is when they try and give you spiritual instruction as to how to pray and to pray for the dead and do things like that. See, the problem is when religious men write books, if they have some good in it, unfortunately, because they have a fallen nature too, it's some truth and some error. And the error is what gets you into trouble. This is the only book where every word is pure, the Bible. This is why although God has allowed Eusebius, Josephus, the Didache, Maccabees to give us some of that teaching, he's waiting to give us the pure history when he returns. But we have enough to go, wow, what a great God. And he's at work. He wanted to show us in the times of apparent silence. And there's times in your life when you think God is silent. But if you stay faithful like Judas Maccabee and like his father did and his brothers did, God will work and never forsake you. And so that's tonight's short message, Hanukkah and Daniel. Yes, brother. Yes. No, and that's interesting. And the brother brings up the point. Yes, in the book of Leviticus, Hanukkah obviously wasn't given by the Lord, and it's not a mandatory festival. And I honestly do not know what he'll do in the millennium if he'll celebrate it. My thought would be he won't. Because when I read the book of Ezekiel, which we're going to be studying soon enough, God help me, you will see that in chapters 40 through 48, when Jesus has the rebuilt millennial temple, he doesn't celebrate Pentecost. Pentecost is missing. Read it. Read the chat. We'll study it soon enough. He's focusing on Passover and the two feasts associated with that, unleavened bread and first fruits, and he focuses on the trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the tabernacles, and he's kind of eliminated the Pentecost. Go ahead. Yes. We know that he died. He died on Passover Day. No, it looks like there was the next, actually, when you go back to the 23rd chapter, the High Holy Day actually was the first day of unleavened bread. Yeah, that was the feast. Okay, go ahead. Yes, Easter is correct. It's based on Ishtar, correct.